Good afternoon. I'm early. We wanted to jump right in.
And good morning.
There's Emerson. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And Happy New Year to the few people who have already joined us.
Yep. I hope everyone's 2020 is off to a great start. So we'll give it a couple minutes, I guess, and then get started. I guess as a setup, I can say that this is similar to our office hours, but we have tried to make it more enticing by promising to do live testing, which we hope is something that people value. And also maybe use it as a chance to try to stump us and come up with scenarios that we don't know how to test. We think we're pretty good at it, but we want to hear the edge cases, and we'll do our best to solve them either now or later.
I think that's one of the exciting things I'm really looking forward to with CES next week and then Project Voice in Chattanooga the following week, is that last year at CES on Project Voice, I saw a lot of edge cases that I really hadn't thought about before. A lot of interesting new innovations that being at those kind of cutting edge events revealed. So I'm super excited, especially as the industry has matured, as more mainstream enterprises have gotten into voice, to see what people have been up to and what they're debuting for this new year.
Yeah, I'm really excited as well about that. So you and I will both be at CES. I have been trying to sort of plan how to approach it. I will say every time I look at the list of people going, it's a little overwhelming. I mean, and so it's hard to even come up with a plan of attack. I'm sure I will come up with one, but the other side of it is I'm just looking forward to just kind of wandering around and really seeing what people are up to. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff that, you and I both follow this space pretty closely. I still think there's going to be a lot of stuff that surprises us.
And that is one really exciting thing about CES, that last year was my first year. I've wanted to go since I was a kid. And I was amazed, 350,000 people last year spread across 4 giant conference facilities. And all day, every day, as we were walking around, I ran into people that I recognized or that recognized me. Some people I'd never met before, but people I'd sent notes to or seen them on LinkedIn or Twitter. People I'd had remote conversations with. So even in a crowd of that size, it was baffling how frequently I met people that had interesting things relevant to kind of the space that we're working in. And it's my understanding, even outside of voice, that's the case for a lot of people that attend CES, is that naturally or through self-selection or however it works, that people have those really exciting kind of meaningful interactions throughout the broadly dispersed crowd.
Yeah, I hope so. This is my first CES, so I'll be interested to see. It's like, when you say 350,000 people, it's like it sounds like a needle in a haystack, but
yeah. I used to do big data analytics for the Army Intelligence and Security Command, and used to say that it's not about finding the needle in the haystack, it's finding the needle in the stack of needles. And so that's really what yes is like.
Great analogy. Does that also have to do with the propensity for people to kind of injure themselves while doing that work.
Oh yeah, or injure themselves in Las Vegas, I guess.
Right. Yeah, well, it should be great, and I think we do continue to think that the progress of voice is really closely tied to the progress of devices. So I mean, I guess just from that angle, I mean, the announcement that was out recently was 100,000 devices supported by Alexa. I mean, again, that's a hard number to get your head around. But that, and what does that really mean? I mean, what are each of those different devices? I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked into it that closely, and even if you did, what would you really make of it? But just the scale of that, I think, is at least to me one of the most exciting things about this space is with that number of devices that are either enabled via voice or controlled via voice. I mean, that creates a lot of momentum. That's creates a lot of opportunity for voice interactions.
And it's also pretty exciting that unlike, let's take automotive, for example, unlike traditional infotainment systems in automobiles that are fairly static from when they're initially released to several years later when the car is archaic at that point, except for Tesla, who's constantly doing over-the-air updates to their even their infotainment system.
Right.
The experience that you have, if it's a fantastic experience day one, it's not going to be a fantastic experience year 5. If it's a bad experience day one, it's going to continue to be a bad experience at year 5. But because of the nature of these voice platforms that are constantly evolving, really without needing any immediate evolution on the device itself, people like Amazon can continue to refine that experience, continue to make it make it more delightful for customers, and continue to encourage usage on that 100,000 devices that they're already supported on today. I mean, there are some things like the first gen Echo devices don't have the same support that the current gen devices do, but but by and large, as they make changes to those voice platforms, they make changes in the cloud. Those changes can be immediately reflected on the 100,000 devices that they support.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a segue to our topic at hand, which is live testing your voice experiences. We don't have a lot of attendance at this point, so these office hours tend to be much lighter attended than our typical webinars. But if you do have questions for us about your skills or other voice experiences around how to do testing for them, please ask us. You can put it into the chat or questions window. And then in the meantime, while we wait for questions, I thought we could do sort of a run through of setting up some batch testing, which is something both Emerson and I have been working on a lot for the past, for a long time, but specifically for the past few months, we've been sort of refining an approach that I think is generally useful, but then quite specifically useful for long form audio testing. And I use the term long form audio. I don't think everybody knows what that means, but it's a catch-all to say, radio playback, streaming music playback, as well as podcasting. And typically the capability to do that on these platforms, it's the same across those different pieces. And so we've come up with some neat ways to do that. We've been working with more customers who have that need. And so we've been trying to just make it as easy as possible for them to get started with it and get set up. So I'm going to share my screen here, but please just interrupt me this is sort of like working in public, I guess. That's what I think of it as, which I think is kind of fun. But we prioritize questions. I mean, that's more important than me trying to finish whatever I was working on today. So where do okay, so I'm going to enable screen sharing. And so what I'm showing here is actually a project that started with what we refer to as a proof of value that Emerson had put together for a customer. And we've really evolved a lot to the point now where I would label it a framework. It still does need more work. And there's lots of improvements and new things that we can see happening with it. But at this point, it's really ready to be consumed by others. And we plan to continue to support our customers with this, but we would also say that people can just come in here and start using it themselves. The idea behind it is, and what I was actually going to do to start off is just lay out the sort of steps that are involved in creating it. So as an outline for what this long form audio testing would look like, these are the steps that we would see for long form audio testing. One, we want to define the, let's call it audio items to test. And probably could find a better term than audio items, but that's, again, trying to use generic terminology for, whether you're talking about a radio station, a song, or a specific podcast, you want to come up with what's that set of things that your users might ask for. Capture that list as a source, and I'll show you what a source is. Configure your environment. And so this is basically setting up stuff that is for Bespoken, as well as potentially things for Amazon or Google Assistant. Configure reporting and test results, and then run it. We really do try to make this as easy as possible. So when we're thinking about this first step, a lot of times this is, at least as a starting point, this is going to come in the form of a CSV file. So we can even just create one right now. So let's call it input.csv. And we've got 2 columns on it. We could open this in Excel as well. And probably the most basic test is to define an utterance, define a transcript, and define a stream URL. So what are each of those properties? Well, our utterance is what we're going to say. Our transcript is what Alexa, I guess that is what we'll set up with for this initial test. But what the voice assistant is saying back. It's going to usually, if you're asking it to play some sort of song or radio station, it's typically going to give you a confirmation saying, I'm going to go ahead and play that track. And then, most meaningfully is the stream URL, which is there's a specific URL that ties off to that audio item, and we want to make sure that it's correct. So let's say that I want to run a simple test we'll do a radio station, and I'm going to pick one that I used to listen to a lot. I don't live there anymore, but I used to live in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to try saying play DC 101. I'm not even sure who's going to fulfill that or if it will be fulfilled, but we can just try that out. I'm going to guess at the transcript. Let's say that it's, I'm playing DC 101 now on John's Echo. And again, I have no idea what the URL is, so I'll just put in a placeholder. You could call this test-driven development. We're defining our test first before we even really quite know what to expect, and we can fully expect it to fail. So we could put in, my incorrect.url. So that looks pretty easy, right? And in setting up that CSV file, the other thing that we need is a simple configuration file. So I've got one documented here. Let's call this long form audio.json. We'll call it long form audio test.json. And there's not a lot to fill out. I mean, there's more properties than this. I think I've documented. Yeah, I've documented them to a certain extent. We're still adding to this, but for the simplest possible case, you can get by with this initially. So you can say things like, you give a name to the job. So that's obvious. That can be anything you want. It just needs to uniquely identify it. A sequence, this is not necessary for every case. And I think for this scenario, it's not needed. But, let's say you have a voice experience where you're expecting the person to do something in session. So first you want them to launch it, and then they're going to either go through some set of options or, just at that point, then they're going to request their audio. The sequence is helpful for that. So you can set up a number of steps before you get to what is the main utterance that's being tested. So if I needed to launch the skill before requesting that track, here's where I would define that. That's not needed for this test, so we're just going to delete that. The source, here we're saying it's a CSV source. We have a couple different options for that. One, we can read jobs or read data from S3. So if you have a set of audio files, for example, in S3, and you want to test with real utterances, we have support for that built in. We have support for reading data from a CSV file, like I was just specifying. And then alternatively, you can also just define your own source, which is not very hard at all. There's really just one method to override, which is this load all. And what you're going to do there, let's say that you have an API that's the source of truth for all these records. You just call that API, get back a bunch of records, and then go ahead and basically push those through this batch tester. But for now, we'll start with just doing a simple CSV case. And so since we're doing a CSV, we define the source file here, and that's just input.csv. And then the store, this part is not absolutely essential, but the reason we have this is, if you're doing things in batch, you're likely going to be running, or you may be running, many of our customers are, through many, many utterances. It can easily be thousands, tens of thousands. We don't have anybody doing hundreds of thousands yet, but certainly you can envision use cases when you're trying to really test speech recognition accuracy, where there's a lot of utterances to go through. Given that, for such a long-running job, we want to store the partial state as we're processing. The reason why is that, essentially, these jobs are prone to fail. They're prone to timeouts. They're prone to the server that they're running on crashing. All sorts of things can happen if you're running something over the course of several hours. So what we do is we store the state as we go through it. And in doing that, we can basically just easily resume the job if there's any sort of failure. And so in terms of storing that state, we support using S3. For a real implementation, that's what we recommend. But for this case, we'll just use a file store because we don't want to deal with setting up Amazon S3 credentials. The reason why we prefer S3, though, is that it's more robust. If you store things locally to a file store, if you have a catastrophic failure of the machine that you're running on, that file store is going to be gone. And so it's not really an industrial strength approach. It's really more, I would say, it's sort of just a testing approach. So one more step for setting this up. I'm going to create some local environment variables. I'm not going to plug this in here because these are meant to be private for the Datadog API key, but we'll show you how we output this stuff to Datadog. One nice thing is that as we're publishing results, we're typically creating CSV files that just show all those results in a tabular format, and then we do nice things in terms of reporting it out to Datadog as well. So there's not a lot of data in this core instance that we have here. But the idea is we can publish the success or failure of each job. And so we'll fill this out further. And you can see the nice thing with Datadog is it's really easy to send the data to it, and then it's really easy to set up reports against it. And so by setting those all up, if you're running this on a daily or weekly basis, you can look at the performance over time of this long form or of these tests. This graph is really not doing it justice, but all of the actual graphs that we have are customer specific, so we'll need to make some enhancements to that. So what I do need to put in here, though, minimally, is a virtual device token. And so now typically we're going to get these from our dashboard here. And so I have virtual devices set up, and I just take one of these and I can plug it in. Now there's a specific virtual device I want to use for this. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment so I can grab that. This will probably be one of Emerson's tokens. I prefer to test with his stuff. I think it sets off devices around his house routinely. Okay, so I put that in. Let me resume sharing. So we defined our virtual device token. We have a CSV file. Let's just go to my README here. Set up using CSV source. So as input.csv, configured in our local.env file, a copy of env.example from the core project. I should configure the Datadog. I guess I'll do that maybe in a minute. That would be the main step here, set up Datadog instance. And I think that's it for running it. Well, I guess the one other thing, so we need to create a package.json. Now, there's two ways we go about this. The package.json is a little bit trickier. I could just do npm install bespoken batch tester -g. And then that would make it possible for me to run this from anywhere. The approach that's slightly more complicated, but I think is better, is to set it up as a package.json, which is essentially an npm file that defines your project. Very popular for JavaScript. The reason to use that is, at least for me, it gives me more, it makes me feel like I have more control over my versioning. So if there's a particular version of the batch tester that I want to use, I can set that in there. I can, if there's also, other dependencies, if I start doing custom code around how I get data out of the source, it's very easy to set that up, set up my code. Basically, it gives us more control, makes it very easy for us to bring in more customizations. So I think it's a nice approach. This is not going to be super friendly for people that are not developers. So you can look at either approach, but I think that the primary audience for this tool anyways is going to be developers. We certainly would work to make it as easy as possible for non-developers to do it, but it's probably not quite there yet. So to set up my package.json, I'm going to do npm init. Example project. We're doing long-form audio testing. And our test command is BBT, which is Bespoken Batch Tester, and then we give it We say process, and we give it the name of the testing file. JSON. And we don't have a Git repository for this yet. We're not going to fill out the keywords. The author is Bespoken. And we'll just say yes. So we have our package.json defined now. Fairly painless. That sets up everything else that we want to do. And now we can also install our batch tester. And we'll say npm install -save. And so that's going to install it locally. It's not going to become global. It's going to become available specifically for this project. And that's saving. This is kind of a slow process. We can use this time to put together more documentation. And so let's take a look at what we've done here. We've got this package.json. We've defined our test script. Now we could also just run this ourselves just from the command line, but it's a pretty common convention to define different little scripts here. And by defining that, it means that we can go in here and we can just type in something like npm test. And geez, I think that's about it. Before I run it, and fingers crossed that it runs correctly the first time. Usually these things don't. But Emerson, any questions on it? Things that I missed or should have explained better?
No, I think, except that I tested PlegNet radio station in the back, and so it's definitely going to fail with what. I think all the setup and everything is complete.
Oh, well, that's exciting. Let's see what the failure looks like. This is the fun of working live. This is really how I would go about doing this. I'd probably spend more time on my outline, and kind of planning how I approach this. But on that, it's just you kind of dive in. So let's see. Okay, so I got an error on the virtual device. And I know why that is. I'm just going to unshare my screen again real quick. How do I disable screen sharing? That was slightly painful. Sometimes the easiest things are so hard. So for the token that I'm using, which is intended to set off all the speakers at Emerson's house, we have that tied to a particular environment. And so I'm just going to set up that environment. And the reason I'm not sharing my screen is I'm just going back into my .env file where we have other sensitive credentials. I should probably put this somewhere else because it's not really a sensitive credential. I'll cut and paste this and explain it in a moment more. But that the idea with the .env file is that when you're running it locally, you put your sensitive stuff there. Non-sensitive configuration things should go into that .json file. But for things that are potentially sensitive, we put them into .env. If we have time today, we'll show you setting this up in a CI environment, which is what we see this is really being run on. I mean, again, these can be very long-running processes. So typically that should be part of a CI process. You shouldn't just run it locally on your laptop like we're about to. And so if you're looking at a CI environment, they're just going to be environment variables there, right? So the .env is a really handy tool/approach for running things locally. Those same sensitive values should then migrate to your actual CI environment if that's where you're operating it for production, which is what we recommend. As long as I've unshared my screen, I'm also going to take this opportunity to grab my Datadog credential. I can plug in my API key. And let me just I'm going to start sharing again here. I guess this is the hard part about doing work in public. Try not to reveal sensitive data. Okay, so we set that up, and for some long form audio cases, we use a special environment. So we added a value like this. That's not even strictly necessary anymore, but what is true is if you are one of the default service providers for Amazon, we do need special permission for testing you. It's a pretty simple process, but you can't just go in through our dashboard and start testing your service as normal. So if you're Pandora or iHeartRadio or some Spotify, just know that the normal dashboard token you create won't work. There is a very simple process for provisioning it. So don't be discouraged by that at all. Just basically, if you are one of those companies you want to do this testing, just email us. We'll get you set up quickly. So I did that bit of configuration, and I'm going to run my test again. And our test ran. Oh, this is exciting. We have results. And they go into our results.csv. And all right, pretty cool. So I don't think DC 101 was iHeartRadio. Maybe it is, or maybe it's just that we have iHeart set up as a default provider. But our actual transcript that we got back was getting DC 101 from Emerson's account. We did get back a stream URL. It's quite long here. And then we can see at the end of this file, and actually let me go in and I'll open this in Excel. It shows nicer in Excel. So, well, should show nicer. Okay, there we are. And we see success equals false, and we see what it was comparing it to. And so why was this false? I mean, our expected transcript doesn't match, our expected stream URL did not match. But pretty easy to correct. So we can actually, now that we have this test result, we can go in here and we can take this and we could take the whole URL and cut and paste it. But by default, we do partial matches, which that may or may not be sufficient for your test case. So having the exact URL is really important. Put in the whole URL. Perhaps there's things that change every time you call it with the URL, though, so you just want to take a portion of it. Regardless, putting it in this way, it certainly makes this input file more readable. And I'm going to take this here. And this, again, we may not want to put in this entire reply. The part about Emerson's iHeartRadio account, I mean, that looks kind of brittle or fragile. If we used a different token, say we used one associated with my account, you know, it's maybe going to say something different. You know, maybe you just want to take this part. Regardless, we could then, you know, it's not too hard to set this up. I guess actually before I go further, I'll just go ahead and run this again now. And let's see if we can get it to pass. Oops. So I need to close this file first. That's just basically a Windows error. I had a file open that I was writing to, so I close that file, run it again. And now our test is passing. That's really exciting. So I think, you know, you can see that this is really easy to set up. You know, this hasn't taken long at all. Let's take a look at Datadog. We should be publishing our data there. Well, oh, okay, I don't think I configured this correctly. So we want to publish our data to Datadog. So let's make that enhancement. So by default, we did not specify that, so it did not. Yeah, it didn't send it to Datadog. Just by saying metrics is Datadog metrics, and then we had set up an environment variable, Datadog API key. that should be enough. So let's run it again and let's see if we get some data into Datadog. So there's no data yet on our dashboard. Let's look at this metrics explorer. There's a little bit of lag, so that could be it, or maybe there's something else that's not. Nope, yeah, it's just lag. Okay, so what was I looking for here in terms of trying to debug what's going on with this data getting up here? There's a few built-in metrics that always come with Datadog, but then this is our own metric that we've defined. And we don't have a lot of dashboards here either. But we can see that we now have captured this test, and we can start to do, all sorts of interesting stuff with it. It would have to be a separate session for us to really drill into everything that's possible with Datadog. But you can easily set up just tons of reports, slicing and dicing the data, all sorts of different ways. And really get a complete view into everything that's happening. These are a few tags we add to the data, but it's easy to tag additional aspects for it, to say that, essentially add metadata to your test, and then, like, okay, the speaker in this test case was male or female. The radio station I was testing was such and such, the song was such and such. And so basically grouping different utterances together and seeing those breakdowns. We'll have, as part of turning this into sort of a full-blown test project for people to just kind of take and use themselves, we'll add those items. And I think, you'll see how nice it is to use Datadog. And, as I think I mentioned earlier, the really nice thing about Datadog is it's an all-in-one solution that's really easy to capture data and report on it. That's why we like using it. So to give you an example of how easy it is to capture data, this is all the code that we have for actually sending stuff there. It's really, really super simple. We could just as easily be using a MySQL database or DynamoDB. I mean, there's tons of options. We like Datadog just because it's got capture and reporting capabilities in one. For stuff like this where you want to get things set up quickly, I think that's a huge benefit. And I didn't create this environment from scratch, but the only step I really had that you didn't see, and it was just because I didn't want to show their credential, not that it's really, really sensitive, but I just went here to integrations, APIs, and I clicked on API key. I mean, that was it. And then I set that in my local environment. I had obviously signed up for Datadog prior to that. So you do have to, if you are not a user of it, you have to give them your email address. But it's, the sign up process is quite painless. And with that, you're off and running. So we see this as a really nice complement to those CSV tabular reports. Again, though, I would also just highlight, if you have a different source that you want to publish to, a different place that you want to publish to, you can easily override these metrics and publish anywhere that you want. And so we have another implementation that publishes to CloudWatch. That's a very popular tool that our customers use. So we send the data to CloudWatch. You can easily do the same sort of slicing, dicing, reporting, notifications there. It's great for that. I guess we emphasize Datadog. I find it a little bit easier to work with than CloudWatch. Both are really great tools, and there's lots of others as well. So it's kind of, pick your preference. We do try to make it easy to do it yourself if you don't have the sort of built-in, even if we don't have current built-in support for it. So that's a lot. Before I go further,
didn't really talk about is in this case we ran one utterance and it took 10 seconds, let's say, start to finish. But for many of these long-form audio content providers, as well as anybody who has maybe not audio focused, but anybody who has a large catalog of data that they might want to be evaluating, running it serially may not be particularly scalable for their testing needs.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's, initially putting this together, Emerson had put this together. We were just going through and just running each one by one. One of the things that we provide in this framework is if you want to run several devices at once, when you're setting up that example file, you just put in multiple virtual device tokens. So if you put in 5 tokens, we'll run 5 tests simultaneously. And so if you have, 2,000 utterances that you want to test, which just by itself takes, I think that takes around maybe 4 hours if you're just running through it. If you set up 4 tokens, it'll take an hour. So it's that parallelization is very easy to configure. That's something that we really baked in here. And we do think that's really an important thing. We also really encourage people to leverage tools like GitLab. We use GitHub for most of our own stuff. We've been using GitLab for this and setting things up for customers just because GitLab is more friendly to multi-tenant management. So sort of data partitioning, and setting that up. I guess I would also just say with GitLab, it has built-in CI/CD that I just love. I'm kind of new to it. I mean, I used it a little bit a few years ago, but not a lot. But I think it's just a terrific tool. And what I would highlight about it, if I can add a file here. So to set up continuous building for this would be a starting point. GitLab is about as simple as Travis, which is a great tool, but it's not super powerful. But I would say it's as powerful as something like a Jenkins or Circle CI. We tend to use Circle CI for a lot of our stuff. It's fantastic, but I think Circle is a little confusing. A nice thing about GitLab is it's powerful, but easy to use, which is always kind of a sweet spot for technology, right? And so if we want to set up running these utterances, as part of a CI, as part of a scheduled process, this is really a starting point. I'm going in here. I created a stage. You don't have to use stages, but if you have multiple different jobs, it's helpful to have that. And why would you have multiple jobs? I mean, let's say you have one set of tests that's going to test invocation names. Maybe you've got a problem with your invocation names. That could be one job. And then you've got another one that's going to test how those tracks are resolved or streams are resolved. So those could be two separate jobs. They're doing different things. And so you set up different stages that make sure that they are run separately. Pretty easy to configure. Our artifacts, we're creating a results.csv file. So we just, what that means is it's going to save that output. And so after this job runs, that CSV file is going to be saved off. We can go and access it at any time for 30 days. And we can also define how these things get run. You know, one thing that I would say is perhaps normal is you can set it up so you can only start this job either manually by invoking it through the web or by setting up a schedule. And so with that, I've got really enough to start running this on a regular basis. I'm not going to create a new repository here on GitLab. We will set that up soon. I mean, this, we really are, this is real work we're doing. So we will include that there. But once I set up that environment, for this specific repository, I would then probably set a schedule. And so I can set up my own using cron syntax, which you might be familiar with. It's pretty easy to work with. Or maybe it's enough to just do every day at 4 a.m. Maybe that meets my need. So that's the cron syntax for that. And then I save it, and I've got it scheduled. That simple. And then this job is running every day at 4 a.m. Really, really nice thing. And we've got 4 minutes left. The one other thing I just want to show to highlight the extensibility of this, because I think it's an important feature, is actually adding some custom code. So as much as possible, we'd like this to be just a matter of configuring your scenario. Everything would be as easy. If you want to send data to Datadog, you just put in Datadog metrics. And if you want to read from a CSV file, you're just saying CSV source. But not everything has been reduced to configuration, and it never will be. Maybe we'll keep adding features to this, and more and more can be done through simple configuration. But it's always nice to be able to just override behavior with code. You might have very special requirements for your testing. For example, every time you load a stream, maybe it's a song, and the song is a certain length. And so you can test the data that comes back and see, using, say, something like FFmpeg, that the durations match what's expected. Something like that, that's not a built-in capability of what we provide, but you can use this interceptor to do it. And so to set that up, I'm going to try not to rush too much, but 3 minutes, I think, is almost enough to show this. And then I can override. There's just a couple routines to override. This will probably blow my time, but I think it's worth showing. If you want to know what you can do with this interceptor, there's two methods. And so I say intercept result, and that's going to take a record and a result. And so that transcript, I put in this whole piece, get DC 101 from Emerson's iHeart radio account. Now, me as a programmer, I immediately think, oh, gee, as part of our framework, we should support regular expressions. We don't at this moment. But let's say that I want to allow for a regular expression test against it. I can just treat that and get that input value. That's my input. And then go ahead and do result. We get the actual transcript. So this is our expected transcript. And with that, I'm treating that expected value as a regular expression. And I think it's just if it's defined. So if this is kind of like pseudocode because I don't think that the way I'm handling that regular expression is quite right. But it'd be pretty quick for me to fix this if I had more than 30 seconds at this point. That's all I have to do. And I compare this and I say if it matches, it's true. If it fails, it's false. And just like that, I've basically added a capability to this little test framework. And then to tie this in, I don't think my code's going to work right, but I'm not ashamed to show it breaking. Class is not a constructor. I think that's because I forgot to subclass it. Oh, I also forgot to export it. Again, this is working live. These are mistakes I make all the time when I'm by myself and fix all the time. If we had an async await problem in here, it would probably touch on all my most common bugs. So they both passed. I don't think this logic is quite correct. I believe this actually returns an array. And so I think the correct logic will be if matches.length equals, is greater than 1. But I would go and look at the JavaScript docs there. I hope you can see, even with this imperfect code, how this would come together and how it's quite straightforward. And I think that's enough for this moment. We've gone over time. Oops. I don't know just why we didn't get more questions.
Yeah, anyone have anything they can leave us with? Topics for future live storm tests, perhaps?
Yeah.
If anything comes up, if you guys think of something, in the past, please feel free to send us an email, either to jpk@bespoken.io or to emerson@bespoken.io. We are eating, sleeping, and breathing testing every day, so we're super excited to see any interesting challenges that you might have. Yeah, maybe to get people to bring the real problems to us.
so they're not just watching me program. We'll keep raising the stakes on what you get. If you can stump us, I don't know, we'll give people a car.
Yeah, I think a car is the next step.
Matchbox car. Anyways, I hope people found this useful nonetheless. And,
yeah,
come and see Emerson and I. We're taking the show on the road. We're going to be at CES. We're going to be at Project Voice. Love to see everybody.
Going to be a fun January.
It will be.
All right.
All right. Well, I think that's enough. Have a great afternoon.
Happy testing.